Somewhere in the ancient dust of Mesopotamia, pressed into clay tablets that survived flood and fire and the slow erasure of millennia, there may be a message. Not a prayer, not a myth in the way we casually use that word, but something that a civilization considered urgent enough to preserve across thousands of years. And the strange part, the part that keeps historians and fringe theorists and curious minds returning to it again and again, is that no one fully agrees on what that message means. The Anunnaki. The name alone carries a weight that is difficult to explain. These were the beings described in some of the oldest written records humanity has ever produced. Figures who descended, who shaped, who warned, and who, according to certain interpretations, left with the promise that the cycle would eventually close. No mainstream institution will anchor this story to a single conclusion, because the evidence, such as it is, refuses to stay neatly inside one discipline. When you line up the oldest cosmological references, the recurring astronomical patterns embedded in Sumerian record-keeping, the sudden ruptures in early human civilization that archaeology struggles to fully account for, something begins to take shape at the edges of what we can confidently say. Not a certainty, something more unsettling than that, a question that keeps reopening. Tonight, we are going to follow that question carefully, through the ancient texts themselves, through the scholars and writers who interpreted them, through the astronomical theory that gave rise to a planet called Nibiru, and finally to the specific claim that has circulated for years now, quietly, persistently, that something significant may align around the year 2030. Whether that date carries genuine historical weight, whether it emerges from a real reading of ancient sources, or from a modern mythology that only borrows the language of antiquity, that is exactly what we are here to examine. There is no need to rush toward an answer. The tablets have waited this long, and some questions, the ones worth holding, deserve to be turned slowly in the dark before the light is applied. To understand the Anunnaki, you have to first understand where they came from, and that means travelling back to a region that most of us only encounter in textbooks, a stretch of land between two rivers in what is now modern Iraq, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and between them a civilization that did something no human culture had ever done before with such consistency and scale. They wrote things down. Mesopotamia was not one culture, but a succession of them, each inheriting fragments of what came before and pressing new meaning into old clay. The Sumerians came first, building cities like Uruk and Nippur, while much of the rest of the world was still organised around small settlements. After them came the Akkadians, who absorbed Sumerian tradition even as they overlaid it with their own language and cosmology. Then Babylon, then Assyria. Each civilization passed the stories forward, and within those stories, the Anunnaki persisted. The name itself translates roughly from Sumerian as those of princely seed, or in some readings, those who came from heaven to earth, though scholars are careful to note that translation is rarely that clean. Ancient languages carry connotations that do not travel easily across 5,000 years. A single word can hold theological weight, administrative weight, and mythological weight simultaneously, and deciding which one dominates in a given context requires a level of certainty the available evidence often refuses to provide. What the texts do tell us, across multiple traditions and time periods, is that the Anunnaki occupied a position of supreme authority in the Mesopotamian divine hierarchy. In Sumerian literature, they appear as a council of great gods, presiding over fate, over judgment, over the order that held the cosmos together. They were not distant abstractions. They were described as deliberating, debating, making decisions that rippled down into human affairs. Some texts place a portion of them in the heavens, and another portion in the underworld, the realm of the dead, where they served as judges of those who passed into it. This dual placement, celestial and chthonic at once, is one of the things that makes the Anunnaki genuinely fascinating to scholars of religion and mythology. They do not fit neatly into a single category. They are neither purely benevolent sky gods nor purely destructive underworld figures. They carry both registers, which is part of why later interpreters found them so elastic, so available for reinterpretation. And that is where the story begins to branch in ways that are important to hold carefully. The Anunnaki, as ancient Mesopotamian theologians conceived them, are not the same figures that entered the popular imagination in the 20th century. When the ancient texts describe them, they are operating within a religious and cultural framework that was internally consistent, even if it is foreign to modern eyes. The jump from ancient deity to extraterrestrial visitor, the specific claim that the Anunnaki were alien beings from another planet who genetically engineered humanity. That interpretation does not come from the tablets themselves. It comes from a particular reading of those tablets, one reading among several, advanced most prominently in the latter half of the 20th century, and built on a set of assumptions that mainstream scholarship does not broadly share. That does not make the original texts any less extraordinary. It does mean that the distance between what the tablets say and what certain modern writers claim they say is larger than it is often presented to be. The challenge of working with Mesopotamian sources is not just linguistic, it is contextual. These texts were written by people embedded in a specific worldview, addressing audiences who shared that worldview, and trying to reconstruct their intended meaning from fragments, many of them damaged, many of them translated by scholars who disagree with one another in significant ways, requires a humility that popular accounts frequently skip past. What we can say with confidence is that these were real texts, produced by real civilizations, describing beings they considered genuinely powerful and genuinely real. Whether that reality was theological, astronomical, or something else entirely is a question the evidence has not closed. And it is precisely that open door, that gap between what is written and what is meant, that has allowed the Anunnaki to travel so far from their origins, further than perhaps even those ancient scribes could have imagined. The clay tablets themselves are a strange thing to hold in mind. Most people who encounter ancient Mesopotamian literature do so through translations, through summaries, through the filtered light of academic editions and popular retellings. But the originals exist, tens of thousands of them, housed in museums across London, Paris, Baghdad, Chicago, sitting in collections that have been accumulating since the 19th century, when European excavations began pulling them out of the ground in enormous quantities. The sheer volume is part of what makes the field both rich and contested. There is simply a great deal of material, and much of it is damaged, incomplete, or exists in multiple versions that do not always agree with one another. The major source texts that get invoked most frequently in discussions of the Anunnaki fall into a few categories. There are the creation myths, most famously the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian text that describes the formation of the cosmos through a battle between gods, with Marduk slaying the primordial chaos deity Tiamat and fashioning the world from her body. There are the king lists, administrative documents that trace lines of Sumerian rulers back into a period when, according to the text, kingship descended from heaven and rulers lived for impossibly long spans. And there are the great epics, above all the Epic of Gilgamesh, which touches themes of divine favour, mortality, a great flood, and the limits of what human beings can know or control. All of these texts contain the Anunnaki in some form. What they do not contain, when read carefully and in context, is a singular, coherent mythology about beings from another planet or a countdown to a 21st century catastrophe. The complication, and this is genuine, is that these texts are fragmented. Many of the most significant tablets arrived in excavators' hands already broken, sections missing, lines eroded beyond recovery. The Enuma Elish survives across multiple copies, but still contains passages where scholars disagree about fundamental readings. Translations made in the late 19th and early 20th centuries have been revised, sometimes substantially, as the field's understanding of cuneiform languages has deepened. A word that one generation of scholars rendered one way might be understood quite differently by the next. This is not a conspiracy of silence or a cover-up. It is simply the nature of working with ancient languages that no living community ever spoke, and that must be reconstructed from the inside out. What is genuinely present in the tablets is a sophisticated cosmological framework in which divine beings oversee the ordering of existence and in which that order is fragile. The Mesopotamians were acutely aware of catastrophe. Their geography made them so. Rivers flooded unpredictably. Cities rose and fell. Kingdoms collapsed without warning. Their literature reflects a worldview in which the cosmos requires constant maintenance, in which the gods could withdraw their favour, and in which human beings existed partly to perform the ritual work that kept divine attention and cosmic stability in alignment. So when the tablets speak of floods, of judgment, of divine councils deliberating over the fate of humanity, they're expressing something psychologically real and theologically serious. The Atrahasis epic, for instance, describes a flood sent by the gods because humanity had become too loud, too chaotic, a disruption to divine order. The parallels to the biblical flood narrative are real and well documented by scholars who debate the direction of influence and the degree of shared cultural inheritance across the ancient Near East. These are not invented connections, they are genuine scholarly questions. What is absent, and this matters, is any explicit reference to a returning celestial body arriving on a modern schedule, any ancient prediction calibrated to the year 2030, any technical specification that maps cleanly onto the claims that circulate in contemporary alternative history. The specific framework in which Nibiru appears as a rogue planet, in which the Anunnaki depart and promise to return, in which ancient king lists encode astronomical cycles pointing to an imminent catastrophe, that framework was constructed largely in the 20th century. It was assembled from ancient pieces, but the assembly itself is modern. The connective tissue is not in the clay. This is where later retellings do something that deserves careful attention. They are not simply translating what the tablets say. They are selecting certain passages, certain images, certain words, and building a new structure around them, one that answers modern anxieties rather than ancient ones. The process is not dishonest in every case, but it is often invisible, presented as recovery when it is closer to reconstruction. The gap between a Sumerian hymn to the Anunnaki as divine judges and a 21st century prophecy about planetary return is not bridged by the tablets themselves. It is bridged by interpretation, and interpretation carries assumptions that vary enormously depending on who is doing it and why. That said, there is something worth sitting with in the underlying themes. The idea of a cosmic order that could be disrupted, of divine forces beyond human control bearing down on civilizations that had grown too confident, of warnings embedded in cycles that only the attentive could read. Those ideas do live in the tablets, not as prophecy in any modern sense, but as a worldview shaped by genuine experience of collapse, of flood, of civilizations that rose and then were simply gone. The ancient scribes were working through something real. The question is whether what they were working through belongs to them, or whether it has been quietly borrowed to say something else entirely, dressed in ancient clothing and sent forward into a world that is, for its own reasons, hungry for warnings. It believes no official voice will speak aloud. And that brings us, gently but inevitably, to the word that became the hinge point, the term that can sit on a clay tablet like an ordinary technical note, and then, centuries later, bloom into a modern apocalypse. Nibiru. If you go looking for Nibiru in Mesopotamian texts with the expectation that it will behave like a proper noun in the modern sense, one object, one orbit, one clear identity, you will be disappointed almost immediately. Because in the older astronomical and religious material, Nibiru is not always a planet the way we mean planet. It is a term of function, a title, a marker, something that points to a role a celestial body is playing in a particular context. In Akkadian, the word is commonly connected to the idea of crossing or a crossing point. Not crossing in the poetic sense, but crossing as in the place where a path intersects another path, where a boundary is passed, where one region becomes another. In a world where the sky was not an empty backdrop but a structured domain, divided into roads, stations, and zones associated with gods, naming a crossing is not trivial. It is naming a moment of transition, a switch in cosmic traffic. That is why, in scholarly discussions, you often see Nibiru treated less like a hidden object and more like a label that can attach to different visible bodies, depending on what is being described. Some texts associate Nibiru with Jupiter, particularly in Babylonian contexts where Jupiter is tied to Marduk, the organizing deity of the imperial cosmos. The logic is not random. Jupiter is bright, dominant, regular enough to serve as a heavenly anchor. When it appears in a certain position, at a certain time, it can act as a sign that the cosmic order is aligned. A crossing in that sense is a point of authority, a confirmation that the system is working. In other contexts, Nibiru is discussed in ways that sound more like a star, or a specific point along the sun's path, or a calculated marker used in the mechanics of observation. Mesopotamian astronomy was not naive stargazing. It was a professional discipline, embedded in the state and the temple, built to track patterns that mattered, seasonal shifts, omens for kings, the timing of rituals, the stability of agriculture, the mood of the gods. Their sky was a calendar, a warning system, and a theology all at once. So when the word Nibiru appears, it can be doing what technical language often does, describing a position relative to something else, a crossing of the celestial equator, a crossing of a boundary between paths of the sky, a point where a planet appears in a zone that carries a particular interpretive weight. It is not that the ancients were confused, it is that the word is flexible by design, because it is naming an event, not necessarily an object. This is where the modern story begins to form, not out of malice, but out of an understandable hunger for solidity, because a flexible term is difficult to build a narrative around. Nibiru as a crossing point does not feel like a secret. It does not feel like an undiscovered planet. It does not give you a date to circle. It gives you a way to read the sky. But the moment you treat Nibiru as a single thing, capital N, proper noun, a specific body moving through deep space, you can start stacking implications on it. If it is a thing, it can be hidden. If it is hidden, it can be revealed. If it is revealed, it can return. And if it can return, it can threaten. The transition happens gradually, and it matters that it happens across different kinds of writing that rarely get separated in the public imagination. There is the scholarly world, where cuneiform specialists are translating omen series, star lists, astronomical diaries, documents that are technical, repetitive, precise, and not written to tell a story. Then there is the popular world, where the same words are lifted out of that setting and placed into a narrative frame that expects drama and continuity. One ancient truth, one suppressed history, one looming event. By the 20th century, especially in alternative history circles, Nibiru starts to harden into a planet with a long, elliptical orbit, absent for long stretches, returning on a cycle that can be turned into a countdown. In these retellings, the ambiguity of the ancient term is treated not as normal linguistic flexibility, but as evidence of secrecy. Multiple identifications become proof that something is being disguised. The fact that Mesopotamian scribes could use a word as a role becomes, in modern hands, a hint that the role is masking an object too dangerous to name plainly. And this is where the difference between ancient astronomical language and modern planetary speculation becomes more than academic. Modern planetary speculation assumes the sky is primarily physical: masses, trajectories, gravitational effects, discoverable through instruments and math. Ancient Mesopotamian sky language assumes the sky is also administrative and symbolic. Bodies in motion, yes, but bodies that mean, bodies whose placements are read against the health of the king, the order of the city, the favour of the gods. When an ancient text describes a celestial sign as a crossing, it may be describing where meaning crosses into consequence. When a modern reader sees crossing, they may picture a planet crossing the inner solar system. Those are not the same kind of sentence, even if they share the same word. But Nibiru becomes central to end times narratives for a reason deeper than a mistranslation. It becomes central because it offers a perfect vessel for modern dread, a catastrophe that is cyclical, impersonal, and cosmic. Not a moral failure that can be corrected, not a political crisis that can be voted away, but an approaching mechanism, a return built into the architecture of the universe. And once you have that, everything else can organize around it. The Anunnaki, already present as powerful figures in a fragmented mythology, can be reframed as agents rather than gods. The flood stories can be reinterpreted as previous passes of the same object. The king lists, with their impossible spans, can be treated as echoes of a cycle too long for ordinary memory. And the ancient obsession with omens can be recast as a scientific surveillance program. Priests as astronomers, temples as observatories, rituals as encoded instructions for survival. None of that is required by the tablets, but the tablets, because they're ancient and broken and difficult, create the kind of silence into which modern certainty can speak. So Nibiru enters the story the way many powerful modern myths enter, as a word that originally described a function in a lived cosmology, then slowly became a name, then a thing, then a threat. A crossing point becomes a returning object. A technical term becomes a prophecy. And once it is framed as a returning object, the story naturally demands a next question. Not what Nibiru meant, not how the Babylonians measured the sky, but when. When does it come back? And it is here, right after when, that the Anunnaki themselves begin to change shape. Because in the older world, they are not aliens, they are not astronauts, they are not engineers in suits, arriving with equipment and a mission statement. They are a category of divine power, folded into a pantheon where the line between nature, authority, and personality is not drawn the way we draw it now. They belong to a mythic bureaucracy, gods who decree, gods who judge, gods who assign roles in a cosmos that is imagined like a kingdom. But the 20th century had its own mythology to offer. And it arrived with electricity, rockets, radio signals, and the first photographs of Earth from above. The sky stopped being a roof and became a destination. The word visitor took on a new kind of plausibility, and old names Anunnaki, Nibiru were suddenly able to migrate into a different story without losing their ancient weight. No academic institution will say it openly, but the pattern is visible if you know how to look. When a culture becomes capable of imagining travel beyond the Earth, it begins to reread its oldest texts as if they were describing that travel all along. Not because the texts have changed, but because the reader has. In the middle and late 20th century, a cluster of popular writers began proposing that the gods of Mesopotamia were not metaphors or personifications or ritual titles, but literal beings, advanced, physical, technological, misunderstood by early humans, and therefore remembered as divine. In this retelling, the Anunnaki are no longer those of royal seed or those who came down in a religious sense. They become those who descended in the most modern sense possible, coming down from the sky as outsiders. And from that single pivot, a whole architecture can be built. If the gods were visitors, then the myths are not myths, but reports. If the reports are distorted, that distortion can be blamed on time, translation, and fear. If they are distorted, then contradictions are not a problem, they are evidence. And if the story is evidence, then it must be evidence of something big enough to justify the survival of the story in the first place. This is where the most influential claims take root. That an advanced group arrived long ago, that they altered the trajectory of early civilization, and that the human species itself is not merely the product of natural history, but the product of intervention. The details vary depending on the author, but the emotional silhouette stays remarkably consistent. There is almost always secret knowledge hidden in plain sight, on tablets, in temple layouts, in star lists, in the strange way ancient kings are described, as if they belong to a different scale of time. There is almost always a motive. Sometimes it is mining, sometimes it is war, sometimes it is survival. And there is almost always a missing chapter in human origins, a moment when something was done to us, or for us, and then covered up. In many versions, the creation of humans becomes a technical process rather than a sacred one. Ancient phrases about shaping clay, breathing life, mixing substances, taking essence from a god. These are reread not as poetry and ritual logic, but as lab procedure. The gods become geneticists. The mixing becomes DNA. The rib becomes a mistranslation that conveniently points towards surgery and cloning. And the old claim that humans were made to work, so common in ancient agricultural societies, where labour is theology, becomes in modern hands a claim that humans were designed as a workforce. Then the next step. If this knowledge is real, it cannot be common knowledge. It must have been suppressed. It must have threatened someone's power. So a conspiracy forms, not necessarily with named villains, but with a logic that is self-sealing. The lack of official endorsement is treated not as disagreement, but as proof of concealment. This is one reason these ideas spread so effectively. They do not require institutional permission. In fact, they gain energy from not having it. And the channels that carried them were perfectly designed for modern belief. Books that promise to decode the past. Documentaries that stitch together ancient ruins, star maps, and ominous narration into a single, seamless suggestion. Early internet forums where every fragmented translation could become a clue, and every gap in the historical record could be filled with intent. The story was portable. It could attach itself to pyramids in Egypt, to megaliths in Peru, to unexplained artifacts, to alignments that look impressive when you choose the right angle and the right date. It could absorb every genuine mystery of the ancient world and treat it as one unified phenomenon. Not many mysteries, one mystery. Not many cultures, one source. And because it was a story about origins, it could also be a story about identity. It offered a way to feel that the human condition is not random, not small, not merely biological. If we were made, then we have a purpose. If we were visited, then we are not alone. If someone hid the truth, then your suspicion becomes a kind of awakening. That is the emotional engine, not gullibility, not stupidity, a hunger. But when you set this modern narrative beside mainstream Assyriology and archaeology, the contrast is not subtle. In the scholarly view, the Anunnaki are not a consistent, singular race with a single biography. They are a shifting group of deities whose roles differ across cities and centuries, appearing in mythic texts that are not trying to preserve journalism. The same divine name can function differently in different compositions because the texts were not written by one author with one canon but by many scribes across long stretches of time, inheriting and reshaping tradition. And the tablets themselves, this matters, do not behave like coded manuals waiting for the correct science fiction key. They are administrative lists, hymns, legal contracts, omen series, rituals, astronomical diaries, royal inscriptions. They are deeply human documents, full of repetition and local context, and often concerned with the immediate pressures of life: grain, land, debt, illness, political legitimacy, the terrifying unpredictability of weather and war. Mainstream archaeology also does not need extraterrestrial intervention to explain the rise of cities, writing, and state systems. The evidence points toward long, gradual developments: domestication, irrigation, trade networks, competition between settlements, innovations that spread because they were useful. The suddenness that popular narratives love often dissolves when you zoom in and accept that our record is incomplete, that preservation is uneven, and that no evidence is not the same as evidence of a cover-up. And yet, even knowing that, people return to the alien Anunnaki story again and again. Because it offers something scholarship rarely offers: a single satisfying line through a messy past. It gives you protagonists, it gives you motive, it gives you a reason that feels proportional to your awe. It makes the ancient world feel like it is speaking directly to the modern world, not through slow translation and cautious footnotes, but through revelation. It also offers a gentler kind of dread. If the architects of our fate are external, gods, visitors, returners, then the chaos of history is not meaningless. It is managed. Even catastrophe becomes part of a schedule. Even fear becomes a calendar. None of that makes it true, but it helps explain why it travels. And once the Anunnaki have been reimagined as modern aliens, once Nibiru has been stabilized into a returning planet, rather than a flexible crossing, a new kind of question becomes irresistible. Not only when does it come back, but what happens when it does. A warning in that world is not a metaphor. It is a message. And if it is a message, then someone somewhere will start looking for the date. And once you start looking for the date, something strange happens. The story stops being ancient and becomes logistical. It becomes an appointment. Because someday is not enough for the modern mind. Sometime in a long cycle does not create urgency. If the warning is meant for us, then it must land inside our own calendar, close enough to feel real, far enough away to feel inevitable. So the search begins, not in the tablets first, but in the habits of belief. This is where 2030 enters, not as a number carved in stone, but as a number that has been selected. If you trace it through modern prophecy and conspiracy circles, 2030 doesn't appear like an ancient timestamp finally decoded. It appears like a convergence point, a place where multiple anxieties, multiple timelines, and multiple internet narratives can overlap without having to agree on their origins. Sometimes it's framed as the end of a cycle, sometimes it's the return window, sometimes it's a deadline set by insiders who allegedly know more than the public, and sometimes it's presented in the most familiar modern form of all: a screenshot of a chart, a fragment of a translation, a date circled like it fell from the sky. But the mechanics of how a date becomes popular are usually more social than astronomical. A date spreads because it is repeatable, because it can be said in one breath, because it sounds plausible when paired with enough atmosphere, and because we have done this before. Earlier Nibiru predictions have come and gone like comets that never arrived. There was the long build-up toward 2003 in some circles, with claims that the object was already visible, that governments were preparing, that the real story would break any day. Then 2012 absorbed nearly everything apocalyptic into itself: Mayan calendars, pole shifts, solar flares, spiritual ascension, planetary alignments, an entire ecosystem of endings compressed into 1 year, because it was convenient, because it was clean, because it already had cultural momentum. When 2012 passed, the narrative didn't die. It simply shed its skin. Deadlines in these communities are rarely treated as falsifiable predictions. They are treated as missed signals, as delayed schedules, as events that were pushed back due to intervention, secrecy, or the mercy of higher powers. The date fails, but the worldview survives, because the worldview has an immune system. If nothing happens, that can be blamed on cover-ups, or on the idea that catastrophe was avoided, or on the claim that it happened spiritually rather than physically. So the deadline moves forward, and that movement is not random. It tends to hop to the next psychologically persuasive ledge, the next round number year, the next decade marker, the next time a broader public narrative is already building tension. 2030 is a particularly convenient ledge. It sits at the edge of what feels imaginable, close enough that people can picture themselves there, far enough that almost anything could happen in between. It belongs to the same mental category as the next recession, the next war, the next big discovery, a future that feels like it has already begun approaching. And it also coincides with very loud, very mainstream conversations about the future. Climate targets, economic restructuring, technological acceleration, demographic shifts. In other words, the world already sounds like it is moving toward a threshold. Even without Nibiru, even without tablets, even without aliens, there is already a sense, widely felt, widely discussed, that the 2020s are transitional and the early 2030s will look different. When a culture is already anxious, it becomes easy to hang a single dramatic story on a date that is already humming with significance. Online, this becomes a kind of craft. Communities recycle dates the way they recycle symbols, because the raw materials are endless. A line from an ancient text can be isolated and made to sound like a countdown. A vague phrase like "in those days" can become "in that year" with the right framing. A translation dispute can be treated as evidence of suppression. A planet in an unrelated astronomical paper can be renamed in the mind, or misread, or intentionally blended with an older rumour. Planet X, a hypothetical outer object, a brown dwarf claim, an infrared anomaly, and suddenly the story has science again. Then numerology arrives to do what it always does, make the human brain feel that it is finding patterns rather than choosing them. 2030 becomes 2030, becomes sums and cycles, becomes correlations with ancient king lists, becomes harmonized with precession, becomes pinned to celestial math that sounds impressive if you don't ask why this math and not other math. And because most people encounter the argument as a finished product, an image, a thread, a confident narration, they rarely see the selection process underneath. The discarded numbers are invisible. Only the number that worked is shown. It's a kind of reverse archaeology. Instead of digging up a date from the past, the date is planted in the past and then excavated as if it were discovered. And here is the sober part, the part that has to be said clearly because the story wants to avoid it. No accepted ancient Mesopotamian source points clearly to the year 2030. Not in the way people mean when they say it, not as a named year, not as a straightforward prophecy, not as a line that a careful Assyriologist can translate and then circle on a calendar. Ancient Mesopotamian texts do contain omens and apocalyptic imagery. They contain flood stories, divine judgments, and cosmic instability. They contain astronomical observation and a deep belief that the sky is meaningful, but that is different from a precise modern date, pinned to a specific future event. Even when Mesopotamian scribes were rigorous about time, when they recorded eclipses, planetary positions, market prices, river levels, they were recording their own time, their own kings, their own months, their own city-states. Converting that into 2030 requires not just translation, but a chain of assumptions about calendars, about cycles, about what Nibiru means in each text, about whether a mythic motif is literal, about whether a symbolic return is physical return, and about whether the ancients were aiming at our timeline at all. It's not impossible for ancient material to be reinterpreted. Reinterpretation is what humans do, but there is a difference between reinterpretation and citation. And 2030, as it is used in these modern narratives, is usually not a citation. It is a destination. So why does it still feel persuasive? Because cultural anxiety doesn't just make people fear the future, it makes the future feel patterned. When the present is unstable, randomness becomes intolerable. A date offers relief. Even a terrifying date can be comforting because it suggests that chaos has an edge, that there is a shape to what is coming, that someone, somewhere, knows the schedule. A specific year also creates community. It gives people a shared horizon line, something to prepare for, argue about, interpret signs around. It turns scattered dread into synchronized attention. And in the age of constant information, synchronized attention is powerful. It can make coincidences feel like omens. It can make unrelated events feel coordinated. It can make the world feel like it is whispering in one direction. 2030, then, is less a message from the ancient world than a mirror held up to the modern one. A year that gathers meaning because we keep pouring meaning into it. But if we're going to treat this as a warning, if we're going to take the claim seriously enough to examine it, then the next step is not to circle a date and wait. The next step is to ask what, in the real world, could actually be tested. What would have to be true in the sky and what would have to be true in the ground, for any version of this story to move from atmosphere into evidence. Testing a story like this requires a kind of discipline that the story itself often resists, because the Nibiru narrative is designed to feel just out of reach, always nearly revealed, always almost confirmed. It thrives in the fog between possible and proven, and that fog is where fear becomes creative. But the real world is not obligated to match our anxieties. The sky does what it does, whether we are ready for it or not, and the ground keeps its records in layers, indifferent to how badly we want a myth to be literal. So if we're going to ask what can be tested, we start with the simplest question. Could a large, undiscovered planet pass near Earth in the near future without being detected? Modern astronomy is not perfect, but it is not blind. We map the motion of planets with extraordinary precision. We track near-Earth objects because we have to. We search for comets, asteroids, and distant bodies because they leave signatures, even when they are faint. A massive object moving through the inner solar system would not be subtle. It would tug on the orbits of known planets. It would disturb the trajectories of spacecraft. It would show itself through infrared heat, if it were large enough, even if it were dark. And if it were close enough to threaten Earth, it would be close enough to be noticed by more than a handful of anonymous accounts posting blurry dots in the sky. In a catastrophic Nibiru scenario, something sweeping into the inner solar system on a timetable that lands around 2030, there is a basic problem that no amount of atmosphere can solve. Gravity is loud. Even if an object were somehow hard to see, it would be hard to hide. You do not need a telescope to detect a planet if the planet is rearranging the solar system. The evidence would show up in data streams that thousands of independent researchers, agencies, and amateurs touch every day. Not as a secret memo, as a mismatch between prediction and observation. That doesn't mean there are no unknowns. There are. The outer solar system is vast, cold, and difficult to survey completely. We are still finding objects far beyond Neptune. We still revise our models. We still discover things that were always there, only now becoming visible to our instruments. And that is where a real scientific hypothesis enters the conversation, often misused by the Nibiru myth because it sounds similar on the surface. Planet 9. Planet 9 is not a prophecy. It is not a countdown. It is not a visitor on a collision course. It is an attempt to explain a pattern. Certain distant objects, far beyond Neptune, appear to have clustered orbits that might be influenced by an unseen massive planet. The idea is debated. The data is incomplete. The searches continue. It is, in other words, science in its normal state, tentative, probabilistic, willing to be wrong. But notice the distance between that and the Nibiru scenario. Planet 9, if it exists, is proposed to be far away, on a wide orbit, taking thousands of years to complete a cycle. It does not swoop into the inner solar system every few millennia like a cosmic hammer. It does not thread a needle between Earth and Mars, while somehow remaining unconfirmed. It is not due in any human year. It is an explanation for subtle gravitational effects at the edges, not a scheduled catastrophe at the center. This is the difference that matters. A hypothesis is built to be tested, and a prophecy is built to be repeated. If Planet 9 exists, we should be able to find it with better surveys, better telescopes, better time, and a willingness to accept that the pattern might have another explanation. If Nibiru exists in the catastrophic form, we should already see its fingerprints all over the mechanics of the solar system. The closer the date, the louder those fingerprints would become. And if you want something even more practical than arguments about gravity, consider the way astronomy actually catches threats. We catalogue near-Earth objects because their orbits can be computed. We can say where they will be decades from now with increasing accuracy. When uncertainty exists, it is measurable uncertainty. It shrinks as we gather observations. The unknowns don't stay romantic for long. They become numbers. A real approaching body would produce that same outcome. More observations, tighter orbit calculations, and a clear trajectory that either intersects danger or does not. The story would not remain vague. Now, what about the other half of the claim? The idea that ancient people knew this, recorded it, and perhaps even received help, warnings, or contact from something not human? This is where archaeology becomes the test, not of belief, but of method. Archaeology does not ask, is it cool? It asks, where is it in the ground? Claims of lost advanced knowledge, prehistoric contact, or sudden impossible technology have a simple problem. Advanced civilizations leave trash. They leave broken tools, manufacturing waste, modified landscapes, mining scars, chemical residues, trade networks, and layers of material culture that do not vanish just because a story wants them to. If there were a global technologically advanced society before known history, we would expect to find more than anomalous stones and intriguing alignments. We would expect consistent, datable evidence across multiple sites and regions, standardized materials, unfamiliar alloys, synthetic compounds, machinery marks that repeat, energy infrastructure, and a clear developmental sequence. Not a single leap, but a trail. Instead, what archaeology often finds is something both less dramatic and more impressive. Humans building complexity gradually, with bursts, collapses, adaptations, and reinventions. We find ingenuity under constraint. We find engineering that looks impossible until you understand labour, time, and techniques. We find knowledge transmitted through apprenticeship, tradition, and experimentation. Sometimes lost, sometimes rediscovered, but still human. This doesn't mean every question is answered. There are genuine mysteries, undeciphered scripts, debated interpretations, gaps in the record, sites that challenge older timelines, cultural transitions that seem abrupt. Archaeology is full of unresolved puzzles, but there is a difference between an unanswered question and an imported conclusion. An unanswered question sounds like, we don't yet know exactly why this collapse happened, or how fast this shift occurred, or what social structure produced this building program. An unsupported conclusion sounds like, therefore aliens, therefore Anunnaki engineers, therefore a warning system planted for 2030. And the bridge between the two is not vibes, it is evidence that can survive hostile testing. This is where peer review matters, not because institutions are saints and not because consensus can't be wrong, but because extraordinary claims require a kind of skepticism strong enough to protect us from our own pattern hunger. Peer review is an imperfect filter, but it is a filter designed to ask the annoying questions. Can someone else replicate this? Does the dating hold up? Are there alternative explanations? Are you ignoring data that doesn't fit? Because real discoveries don't fear methodology. They need it. The most persuasive Nibiru narratives often reverse the burden of proof. They treat mainstream doubt as evidence of suppression. They treat a lack of evidence as evidence of a cover-up. They turn uncertainty into confirmation. But in science and archaeology, uncertainty is not a blank check. It is a temporary label. It is a space waiting to be filled by better work, not by louder certainty. So the balanced position, the one that keeps curiosity alive without becoming gullible, looks like this. It is reasonable to admit we have not catalogued every object in the far solar system. It is reasonable to admit that ancient texts can be complex, metaphorical, and sometimes misread. It is reasonable to admit that human history contains surprises and that our understanding evolves. It is not reasonable to compress those truths into a specific, catastrophic schedule without a chain of evidence that can be checked. If Nibiru is real in the way the modern myth needs it to be, astronomy should reveal it. If ancient contact is real in the way the modern myth implies, archaeology should reveal it. And if neither reveals it, not as a feeling, not as a mood, but as data, then what remains is not a secret planet. What remains is the warning as a human artifact, a story shaped like a test of the future that might actually be a test of us. How we handle uncertainty, how we choose between curiosity and panic, and how easily a whisper across time can become a deadline we built ourselves. And that brings us to the part that refuses to die, even when the numbers don't cooperate. Because if the warning were only about an object in the sky, it would rise and fall with the evidence. It would be a hypothesis you could retire, a claim you could test, reject, and move on from. But the Anunnaki and Nibiru story persists the way certain dreams persist. Not because they're verifiable, but because they're meaningful, because they attach themselves to pressures that already exist inside us, and then they give those pressures a shape, a return, a reckoning, a hidden truth finally revealed. There is a reason the gods will come back, is older than Mesopotamia, older than any one set of tablets, older even than writing. It's one of the simplest structures the human mind can build. Someone powerful left, the world degraded, and one day the powerful will return to judge what happened in their absence. It is the same structure behind messianic promises and apocalyptic fears, behind kings who claim divine mandate, behind movements that insist history is not a chaotic river but a planned story with an ending. The names change, the imagery changes, the moral logic stays strangely stable, because it solves two unbearable problems at once. First, it says the world is not random, the chaos has authors, and second, it says our suffering is not pointless. It is watched, it is measured, it will be answered. This is why cosmic judgment is such a magnetic theme. Not because people are eager for punishment, but because judgment implies a court and a court implies order. The idea that something is keeping score is, in a dark way, comforting. It means the universe is not indifferent. It means the disasters are not just weather and geology and human error. They are part of a ledger. The Nibiru myth takes that ancient hunger for order and gives it modern fuel. It tells you the elites know. It tells you the institutions are lying. It tells you the official story is too small, too sanitized, too human. And if you have ever looked at history, really looked at it, at how quickly societies can tilt into famine, war, collapse, and forgetting, then you already know how plausible it feels that something enormous could be happening beneath the surface, while everyone pretends it isn't. The story flatters a certain kind of fear, not the fear of dying, the fear of being fooled, the fear that the real world is being run by people who are either hiding the truth or too incompetent to see it. The fear that the rules you are given are not the rules that matter. And once that fear takes root, a myth like this becomes useful. It becomes a lens. Every anomaly becomes a clue. Every institutional hesitation becomes proof of suppression. Every gap in knowledge becomes a doorway. Then there is the other ingredient, forbidden knowledge. The tablets, the translations, the ciphers, the real meanings that academia supposedly refuses to admit. This is not just about ancient languages. It's about a very modern craving to be initiated, because most of life is lived on the outside of closed doors. The doors of expertise, the doors of power, the doors of wealth, and a story that says you can see behind the curtain if you're willing to question is intoxicating. It offers a reversal. The believer becomes the informed one. the outsider becomes the witness. The world stops being a maze and becomes a puzzle. And puzzles can be solved. Even the darker parts of the narrative, civilizational collapse, resets, floods, fire from the sky, have their own appeal, and it's worth saying that out loud. Collapse is terrifying, but it is also simple. A collapsing world is a world where the noise stops, where the contradictions resolve into one urgent truth: survive, rebuild, remember. For people exhausted by complexity, by political theatre, by constant information, without wisdom, the fantasy of a reset can masquerade as relief. Not consciously, not proudly, but deep down where the mind negotiates with dread. And divine return is collapse with authority. Not just that the world ends, but that it ends for a reason, that someone meant it. Now add one more layer, the one that makes the Anunnaki story uniquely sticky in the modern era. Ancient authority with alien distance. If you place the source of the warning in the hands of ordinary humans, the story becomes debatable. Human motives intrude, politics intrude, mistakes intrude. But if you place it in the hands of beings who are older, higher, not from here, then the warning gains weight without needing proof. It borrows the aura of the unknown. It becomes a message from a higher floor of reality. And that taps into something very old in us, the feeling that the ancients were closer to truth. We know rationally that ancient people were not superhuman. We know they lived with disease and scarcity and limits. But we also know they watched the sky with patience we no longer have. They aligned stones to solstices. They kept calendars without satellites. They carried myths for thousands of years without printing presses. So when we encounter an ancient text that is strange, symbolic, and partially broken, we are tempted to treat it like a coded transmission. We imagine it contains more than it says, because the past itself feels like a sealed vault. And every sealed vault invites fantasies of what's inside. That is how a story can feel true without being certain. Emotional truth is not the same as factual truth, but it is not nothing either. It is the truth of resonance, the truth of recognition. The way a narrative can describe the shape of our fear with such precision that we confuse the fit for proof. When people say, "I don't know, but it feels real," what they often mean is, it matches the world as I experience it. A world where systems feel fragile. A world where leaders seem unserious. A world where disasters stack, and the future feels like a narrowing corridor. In that environment, a deadline like 2030 doesn't function only as a date. It functions as an organizing principle, a way to compress dread into a calendar box you can point at, a way to convert free-floating anxiety into a single story with a single antagonist, a single arc, a single resolution. And that is why warnings like this echo across time. Not because clay tablets can forecast orbital mechanics, but because humans keep reinventing the same emotional weather. We keep building myths that say something is coming. Sometimes that something is literal, sometimes it's metaphor, sometimes it's both, depending on how you hold it. So here is the question that lingers beneath all the translations and all the astronomy. What if the real warning was never "a planet will return"? What if the warning was civilizations collapse when they forget how fragile they are, when they treat power as permanent, when they treat knowledge as possession instead of responsibility, when they build towers and call them eternal and stop listening for the quiet signals that the world is changing beneath their feet? In that reading, Nibiru is not an object, it is a symbol with teeth, a name we give to the moment when consequences arrive, whether from the sky, from the sea, from our own hands, or from the slow mathematics of neglect. And if that is the case, then the story doesn't have to be literally true to be urgent. It only has to be timed to the human heart, because the most enduring prophecies are not the ones that predict the future. They are the ones that diagnose us. And so we arrive at the quietest part of the story. Not the tablets, not the translations, not the arguments about what a single Sumerian word can and cannot mean, but the waiting. Because if you strip this down to what Mesopotamia actually gives us, you get something very different from the modern myth. In the old tradition, Anunnaki is not a single clean category of extraterrestrial engineers with a timetable. It is a shifting family of divine powers, sometimes celestial, sometimes chthonic, sometimes political in the way gods often are, mirrors of how humans organize authority. And Nibiru, in the texts that are usually cited, does not reliably behave like a hidden planet on a collision course. It behaves like a term, a marker, a crossing point, sometimes a title applied to a visible body, sometimes a concept in a sky crowded with symbols. The modern Nibiru mythology does something very human with that ambiguity. It hardens it. It turns the soft edges into a single object, a single intention, a single deadline. But the honest shape of the evidence is not a siren. It is a question. It supports interpretations more than certainties. It invites you to notice how myths migrate, how meanings accumulate, how a culture's fears can attach themselves to ancient names like barnacles on an old ship. And it asks quietly whether we are reading the past or using the past to read ourselves. If 2030 comes and goes like any other year, the sky unchanged, the story will not vanish. It will simply change clothes. It always does. So tonight, instead of forcing an ending, you can let the unanswered possibilities sit beside you. Not as panic, not as proof, just as a mystery with room to breathe. And if you've made it this far, gently take a second to like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell me what you think this warning really is. History, metaphor, or something in between. And if you feel like sharing, comment where you're listening from, as the world turns quietly toward whatever comes next.